On a farm, we see Oliver, his son Henry, and a young man named Tucker driving a flock of sheep back to the pen. Everything goes smoothly and peacefully as usual, but Angus, Henry's older brother, watches from a distance with eyes full of jealousy and frustration because he isn't as good at farm work as his younger brother. On top of that, Angus has a broken leg and can only lie at home all day unable to do anything. So he decides to take out his anger on Henry's beloved sheep named Doobie. Carrying a small axe, Angus approaches Doobie. Just a few minutes later, Henry returns to the farm on his motorcycle looking for Doobie but unable to find him. When he enters the sheep pen to check, he is horrified as parts of Doobie's body fall from the ceiling onto him. Even worse, Angus, wearing the skin of the poor sheep, approaches and attacks Henry. Henry is overwhelmed with terror. At that very moment, a farm worker named Sonora enters and interrupts the situation. She announces that their father has had a motorcycle accident and died before he could be saved.
It's your father. There's been an accident.
The story jumps 15 years into the future. Henry has left the farm and is now living in a big city. He returns to visit his late father's old farm. However, due to the psychological trauma from the past and what his brother did, Henry suffers from an intense fear of sheep. He can't even get close to one. On the way back to the farm, he meets two environmental activists, one named Experience and the other named Grant. They're also heading to the farm, suspecting that it houses a secret lab conducting cruel experiments on animals. They want to expose the truth. A while later, Henry arrives at the old family house, but the place looks deserted with no one around. He walks in and sees photos of his father in the old office when suddenly a gun is pointed at the back of his head. Luckily, the person holding the gun is Mrs. Mack, who mistook Henry for an intruder. Once she realizes who he is, she immediately apologizes and hugs him. After they catch up and reminisce, Henry decides to search for his brother Angus, who in fact was the one who sent him the invitation to return. Henry came back to the farm mainly to negotiate buying back his share of the property. When he reunites with Angus, Henry isn't sure if he truly wants to sell his inheritance, as the farm is the only memory he has left of their late father. However, Angus promises to pay in advance and leads Henry into the office to give him the check. Meanwhile, the two environmental activists Grant and Experience arrive at the farm and discover a secret laboratory. Nearby, they spot a female scientist named Astrid Rush, along with her team of assistants transporting a mysterious shipment. Realizing the research team isn't paying attention, Grant rushes over to investigate and finds 3 cylindrical containers. However, Dr. Astrid spots Grant sneaking in and immediately orders her team to chase after him. Grant manages to grab one of the containers and escapes into the forest with Experience. Once they're temporarily safe, the two examine the cylinder closely and discover that it contains a genetically modified creature. They realize this is crucial evidence that could be used to expose those behind the farm and put an end to these cruel experiments once and for all. But Dr. Astrid and her team of assistants didn't give up. They headed into the forest, continuing their pursuit of the two intruders. Grant ran ahead to distract them, but while running he tripped over a tree branch and dropped the cylinder. When he got up and looked for it, he discovered the cylinder had shattered and the creature inside was gone. Just seconds later, the creature suddenly appeared behind Grant. It was a zombie sheep. It lunged at him and bit his ear. After a struggle, Grant managed to fight the sheep off and throw it away. However, the bite had infected him and Grant began to feel weak, his body no longer functioning normally. At the same time, Henry had just finished signing the transfer papers and asked Angus about his plans for the farm. Angus said he was investing in modern agriculture and would soon revolutionize the industry with his new project. Since the contract had been signed, Angus asked his brother to leave the farm. Before departing, Henry went to say goodbye to Sonora. She gave him a farewell gift, an old trophy their father had once won in a best farmer competition. Mrs. Mack told Henry that Tucker, his childhood best friend, had now become the farm's manager. She asked Tucker to give Henry a tour of the property. The two were overjoyed to see each other again after so many years apart. They hopped into a pickup truck and drove out to the fields where the sheep were being raised. Meanwhile, the small zombie sheep was still wandering and had reached the field. It began making strange noises that attracted another lamb nearby. As the lamb approached, it was immediately bitten on the snout by the zombie sheep. Not long after, Tucker brought Henry to the field in the pickup truck. On the way, they saw a lamb standing in the middle of the road with a wounded snout. Haunted by his past trauma, Henry panicked and stopped Tucker from getting closer. But Tucker reassured him that there was nothing dangerous and stepped out of the truck, intending to lead the lamb across the fence. Just then, Experience suddenly appeared. While no one was paying attention, she took Tucker's gun and pointed it straight at them. She demanded that they follow her into the forest and asked if they knew where Grant was. Neither Henry nor Tucker knew who she was talking about. Henry suggested that his brother Angus might be able to help her find her friend. When she found out Henry was the brother of the farm owner, Experience grew angry and threatened them with the gun. However, the safety was still on and she didn't know how to release it. Tucker offered to teach her how to use the gun, but as soon as he held it, he immediately took it back. Realizing she had been deceived, Experience left to continue searching for Gran. At that moment, Gran was in another part of the forest and was exhibiting very strange behavior due to being infected from a bite. Although he was an advocate for animal rights and environmental protection, Gran was gradually losing control. He saw a small rabbit pass by and shockingly devoured it alive. Meanwhile, Tucker and Henry returned to the pickup truck and were surprised to see Experience coming back. She apologized for threatening them and explained that she had broken into the farm only to stop the horrific experiments being conducted on animals. Tucker didn't understand what she was talking about, but before he could ask, he saw smoke rising from the house of Mike, one of the farm workers. The three of them immediately ran there. When they entered the house, they found a pot of noodles burning on the stove. The kitchen was a mess, as if a fight had just taken place. They began searching for Mike, but instead found a lamb with a severely injured snout. The lamb suddenly attacked the group, forcing them to flee into a room. Inside, they discovered Mike lying on the ground, his neck nearly torn to shreds. Then the zombie sheep began ramming the door with its head, eventually forcing Tucker to shoot and kill the creature with his rifle. After the intense confrontation, the three decided to leave the house, but they quickly realized that more infected sheep had appeared outside, scattered all around. Fortunately, the sheep hadn't noticed them yet. However, Henry was still paralyzed by his fear of sheep and couldn't move forward. Experience helped him face his fear, telling him to focus only on her voice and not think about anything else.
Feel the energy drawing out of the soil.
Come on, Henry.
Can you feel it?
Yeah.
You are a mighty Cody, totally relaxed.
The plan worked, and they had almost reached the truck when suddenly a zombie sheep jumped inside and attacked Tucker. Henry and Experience quickly climbed into the back of the truck while Tucker sped off, trying to shake off the creature. Henry attempted to save his friend by starting up a chainsaw they found in the truck bed, but the bumpy dirt road caused the truck to jolt violently, and he dropped the saw onto the ground. The situation became even more chaotic. Tucker struggled with the sheep, but in the end it managed to bite his leg. Even so, he mustered enough strength to throw the creature out of the vehicle and climb into the back of the truck. At that moment, the now driverless truck barreled straight toward the edge of a cliff. Just before it went over, Henry, experienced Tucker, and Tucker's dog jumped out in time while the truck plunged into the lake below. The group was lucky to survive, but they still needed to return to the farm and uncover what was really going on. Elsewhere nearby, Gran was wandering around the farm like someone who had lost his mind, unaware of where he was going. His body was gradually being affected by the virus, his teeth began to deform, and white fur started growing on his face as if he were turning into a sheep. Along the way, Gran happened to run into Angus. Annoyed to see Gran blocking the road, Angus got out of his vehicle to confront him. Suddenly, in an unconscious act, Gran bit Angus on the arm and then fled. Back with Henry and the group, they continued their journey back to the farm. However, Tucker began to feel exhausted due to the bite on his leg. When he removed his shoe to check, he was horrified to see that his foot had started to transform, looking like a sheep's hoof. They realized that if they didn't find a cure soon, Tucker would turn into a half-human, half-sheep creature. Things took an even darker turn when they saw more infected sheep appearing on the hilltop, charging down at a terrifying speed. Tucker ordered his dog to run home for safety while he, despite being injured, did his best to flee with Henry and Experience. After a tense and dramatic chase, they finally reached a hidden laboratory. Inside, they discovered the gruesome sight of a sheep's corpse hanging in a disturbing state. All three were horrified by the twisted experiments that had been taking place there. Suddenly they ran into Angus and Dr. Astrid. Henry tried to warn them that the sheep were spreading an infection everywhere, but his brother didn't believe him and claimed he was merely creating genetically modified sheep. His goal was to present this invention to investors at a trade fair to make the project even more profitable. Henry tried to convince Angus by asking Tucker to show his brother the infected wound on his leg, but Dr. Astrid immediately injected Tucker with a sedative, causing him to collapse to the ground. Henry wanted to help, but Tucker told him and Experience to escape from the lab because they had no other choice. The two of them were once again chased by the flock of sheep and were eventually cornered at an old well that had once been used to dispose of animal experiment remains. Angus appeared shortly after, but when Henry pleaded for help, Angus refused and said he wouldn't let his plan be ruined. As the infected sheep drew near Henry, and Experience slipped and fell into the well, landing on a pile of shredded animal corpses. They were forced to move deeper into a tunnel inside the well to look for a way out. Experience lit a candle to light the way. At the end of the tunnel, they found only a tiny exit hole just big enough to crawl through. However, Experience refused to go further because she suffered from claustrophobia, just as Henry feared sheep. When they heard the sound of the sheep drawing near, it meant the animals had jumped into the well and were now pursuing them. Henry reassured her by asking her to focus on his voice, just like she once helped him overcome his own fear. Thanks to that, Experience bravely crawled through the narrow passage. Just then, a zombie sheep tried to bite Henry's leg, but she reached the tunnel's end in time and pulled him through. The sheep were trapped on the other side of the tunnel, and Henry used the candle to set them all on fire.
This way.
Experience thanked him for saving her life. After that, the two left the tunnel and ran to the stables to wash themselves. Suddenly, they heard a strange noise coming from inside. As they got closer to check it out, they discovered a giant half-human, half-sheep creature approaching them. Experience realized the creature was wearing the same clothes as Gran, her teammate. That meant Gran had been transformed into a hybrid creature. Experience tried to awaken his memories, but Gran seemed to have lost all control and threw Henry across the room with a single push. She helped Henry up, and they both ran out of the stable. Henry quickly locked the door, trapping the hybrid creature inside. They had escaped the monster, but Henry started to worry that his friend Tucker might also be turning into one of those creatures. And just as he feared in the laboratory, Tucker truly began to transform. His teeth started to grow long and sharp like a sheep's. Dr. Astrid took a sample of the antidote serum to experiment with, but instead of injecting it into Tucker immediately, she decided to wait and see how the disease reacted to the test sample. Just a few minutes later, Tucker had fully transformed into a half-human, half-sheep creature, exactly like what had happened to Gran. Then Dr. Astrid injected the serum into him, and to her surprise, it worked. The transformation was reversed, and the subject returned to his normal human form. She was very pleased with the result and took a sample from Tucker to replicate the effect. But just as she stepped out of the lab, she found her assistant being eaten alive by a horde of zombie sheep. Terrified, she tried to flee into the forest, but her foot got stuck in a muddy pit. As she struggled to stand, she saw sheep hooves approaching, and without hesitation, the zombie sheep began to devour her. At the same time, Angus returned to the farm to prepare for his project presentation with the investors. However, when he looked in the mirror, he noticed his face was paler than usual, and the bite on his arm was becoming more serious. Despite that, he still took the stage and began presenting the revolutionary achievements of his project. At the end of the speech, Angus signaled his assistant to open a section of the stage, and from there a fully developed prototype sheep named Oldfield was brought out. At first, everyone in the auditorium was amazed by the creature. But moments later, the sheep began bleating loudly and incessantly, as if signaling a bad omen. That omen quickly turned into reality when dozens of zombie sheep burst into the ceremony, attacking everyone in their path. The entire auditorium descended into chaos. Angus had completely lost control of the situation. He hurriedly fled with the sheep Oldfield. While escaping, Angus ran into another infected sheep, but instead of attacking the sheep, let him pass without doing anything. Angus found this strange, but when he looked down at the bite on his arm, He was horrified to see that his hand had turned into a sheep's hoof. Clearly, the zombie sheep did not attack those who were already infected, and now he was on the verge of becoming a hybrid creature. Not long after, Henry and Experience also arrived and witnessed the blood-soaked scene as the zombie sheep attacked the crowd. Mrs. Mack suddenly appeared with her vehicle, picked them up, and took them back to the farm. On the way back, they discovered the roads were already swarming with man-eating sheep and night was beginning to fall. They reached the house and tried to call for help using the kitchen phone, but all the lines had been cut without warning. Suddenly, Gran, now fully transformed, charged into the house and knocked Henry to the ground. In a moment of desperation, Henry tried to grab Mac's gun, only to realize it was out of bullets. The hybrid creature attacked him and pinned him to the floor. Henry could barely fight back, but Experience arrived just in time, striking Gran hard on the neck with a stick, knocking him unconscious. They had temporarily won this encounter. However, the zombie sheep began surrounding the house and were about to break down the doors. Henry and Experience used furniture in the house to block the entrances, while Mac told them there was still a phone in Angus's office. Henry rushed there and was shocked to find Angus and Oldfield hiding inside. He became furious, realizing that Angus was the one responsible for this entire disaster. Seeing that his brother had no intention of helping, Henry decided to take matters into his own hands. He grabbed their father's old gun and declared that he would destroy all the creatures, starting with Oldfield. But Angus stepped in front of the sheep and said he wouldn't let Henry do that, revealing that Oldfield had been cloned from his own DNA. Moreover, he showed Henry the bite on his arm, proving that he too was slowly turning into a hybrid creature like the others. In the end, Henry raised the gun, threatening to shoot Angus, but then changed his mind and handed the gun to his brother. He left the office and met up with Mac and Experience, calling on them to retreat. Before leaving, he picked up their father's old trophy once more. When the three reached the exit, they saw that the farm was already surrounded by countless zombie sheep. In the middle of them were Angus and Oldfield, heading toward the private airstrip. Henry guessed that Angus was planning to escape the country by plane, but if that happened, the virus would spread to other places. He made the decision to stop it. However, when he looked down at his hand, he noticed that the bite he received during the fight with Gran was starting to show signs of transformation. Realizing that he had now become a threat to Mac and Experience as well, Henry chose to go alone and urged them to escape as quickly as possible. Experience was moved by Henry's bravery and began to develop feelings for him. She hoped he would return safely. Now Henry had to find a way to sneak past the herd of sheep without being detected. He saw some fur coats in the truck and put one on to disguise himself as a sheep. While trying to walk through the flock, he used his father's trophy to hit a sheep in order to clear a path, but this action revealed his true identity. However, since he had already been infected by the sheep virus, the hybrid creatures didn't attack him and instead allowed him to pass. At this moment, Mac and Experience decided to return and help Henry. The three of them got in the vehicle, armed themselves with guns, and began fighting back, eliminating the nearby zombie sheep. Meanwhile, Angus had started up the plane, preparing to take off with Oldfield, but the virus inside him had reached its final stage. He began to suffer immense pain as the transformation progressed. His teeth fell out, his face became deformed, and his hands turned into sheep hooves. He screamed in agony as his body was no longer human. Henry reached the landing area and began searching for his brother in the storage area. Suddenly, Angus, now fully transformed into a hybrid creature, lunged out in a surprise attack and pinned Henry against the wall, revealing his grotesque half-human, half-sheep face. Henry tried to awaken his brother's memories and conscience, reminding him that if Angus hadn't done the wrong thing in the past, the two of them could have taken care of the farm together. But Angus didn't listen and continued his assault. Henry was forced to strike Angus hard in the neck with their father's trophy. Even so, it wasn't enough to bring him down. The transformation had made Angus stronger, turning him into a superior hybrid creature. Henry reached for his gun but was knocked away and thrown back by Angus. At that moment, the plane began to circle around the landing area. Quickly, Henry came up with a plan. He would use the plane's propeller to kill Angus. At that moment, Tucker's little dog suddenly appeared and began barking loudly, drawing Angus's attention. Henry told the dog to keep barking to distract Angus, causing him not to notice the approaching plane from behind. The plan worked. The plane's propeller struck Angus, defeating him and bringing him down, leaving him unable to fight back. Henry then noticed his own arm beginning to show signs of transformation. But before he could react, Angus, who seemed to have been defeated, suddenly rose up behind him. Fortunately, Tucker arrived just in time in a jeep and shot a type of serum into Angus's mouth, then did the same to Henry. Henry reacted violently at first but quickly returned to normal, completely cured of the virus. They explained that Tucker had managed to retrieve the antidote serum from the lab just in time, and now they could use it to cure everyone who had been infected. Angus was also injected, reversing the transformation, but his body was severely injured and he fell unconscious. Henry, Tucker, and Experience reunited and shared the whole story with each other. Their mission now was to gather all the zombie sheep into the pen and administer the antidote. However, the amount of serum wasn't enough to cure them all. Suddenly, despite his severe injuries, Angus survived and reappeared. Although he had returned to human form, he still tried to control the flock of sheep to carry out his insane plan. But since he was no longer infected, the zombie sheep no longer recognized him as one of their own. They immediately attacked and tore him apart. Henry was devastated by the loss of his brother. He lit a lighter and threw it into the middle of the zombie flock, burning the entire herd to ashes. The next morning, Henry and his friends gathered all the remaining infected hybrid creatures and began injecting them with the antidote serum. Among them was Gran, who finally returned to his human form but was filled with guilt over the things he had done while transformed, especially eating other animals. At the end of the film, Henry decided to keep his father's farm and live there together with Experience, Tucker, and Tucker's little dog. However, the dog now seemed different. Instead of barking, it began to bleat like a sheep, hinting that it too had been infected by the virus. And that was the final twist of the film. So what do you think of the story?